Hey, it's Mark here, and welcome to the next edition of the Employee Survival Guide, where I tell you, as always, what your employer does definitely not want you to know about, and a lot more.
Have you ever wondered what happens when the unstoppable force of post-pandemic return to office mandates meets the immovable object of federal anti-discrimination law?
Man, it is a massive collision. And, it's happening all over the country right now.
It really is. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today, we are looking at this exact conflict, but we've got the raw, unfiltered court documents from basically ground zero of this fight.
Yeah, we have an incredibly revealing stack of primary sources to go through today. They're out of the Central District of California.
Right. And for you listening, the case is called Daryl Whitfield v. Kristi Noem.
Exactly. And Noam is being sued in her official capacity as the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security.
Which is a pretty heavy-hitting defendant.
Oh, definitely. And the documents we're looking at include the plaintiff's second amended complaint, a federal judge's ruling on a motion to dismiss, and the government's official answer.
Which is quite the stack. And I just want to make this super clear up front. Our mission today isn't to take a side.
No, not at all.
Right. We're not declaring a winner or endorsing any politics here. The goal of this deep dive is simply to demystify the federal litigation process for you.
Yeah, we're basically going to decode exactly how a complex employment lawsuit is built by a plaintiff and, how the government constructs a defense to shut it down.
And then ultimately how a federal judge evaluates that entire conflict at its earliest stages.
Right. And that evaluation always starts with the plaintiff's initial filing, because the burden is entirely on the plaintiff to construct a reality for the court.
They have to tell the story first.
Exactly. They have to present it so the court can look at it and say, if these specific facts are proven, federal law has been violated.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you read the second amended complaint, it essentially functions as a detailed architectural blueprint, or like a movie script.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, the plaintiff's job here is to set the scene. They have to provide these granular, visceral details to paint a really stark picture of sudden, harsh changes in working conditions.
And Daryl Whitfield is the architect of this specific filing. What's crazy is that he is proceeding pro se.
Meaning he's representing himself.
Right. Which makes the level of detail in his filings even more impressive, honestly. I mean, he is going up against the DOJ.
Yeah, going up against DOJ lawyers on your own is no joke.
So let's look at the foundation of his blueprint.
Okay.
Whitfield is an African-American male, and he's a 100% service-connected disabled veteran.
And his medical documentation lists a really severe combination of conditions.
Yeah, it's a long list.
Yeah.
Chronic migraines, sinusitis, rheumatoid arthritis, tinnitus, GERD, ADHD, and dyslexia.
You really have to look at his work history to understand why those specific medical conditions form the core of his legal argument.
Right, because he's been an import specialist at U.S. Customs and Border Protection CBP since 2014.
Yes. And from 2015 to 2020, he successfully worked what they call a 410 schedule.
Which means he was teleworking 3 days a week and going into the office 1 day a week.
Exactly. Then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic hits. And like millions of others, he goes fully remote.
Right. And for over 2 years, he teleworks full-time. And importantly, the complaint notes he meets all his performance expectations during that time.
But then we get to 2023 and early 2024, and CBP starts ending its remote work policies.
The infamous return to office push?
Yep. So Whitfield submits formal requests, along with his medical documentation, to continue his full-time telework. But CBP denies them.
And that denial is the catalyst for the whole lawsuit.
Because after they deny it, Whitfield files a formal EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity complaint.
Right. And according to his lawsuit, this is when the retaliation kicks in.
This part is wild. The complaint alleges that CBP imposed an interim schedule on him.
Yeah, an interim schedule that actually increased the number of days he was required to be on site.
Right. And then the complaint states CBP offered to restore a modified telework schedule only if he withdrew his EEO claims.
Which is a huge allegation. Offering an accommodation in exchange for dropping a civil rights complaint?
Yeah, and he refused to do it. So when he refused, CBP allegedly revoked all his telework entirely.
And this is where that blueprint analogy you used gets incredibly specific.
Oh, man, the details here. I mean, if you've ever submitted an HR request for, like, a standing desk, you know it's a headache.
Right, it takes forever.
But Whitfield's case shows what happens when that standard HR process just goes nuclear.
Yeah, he claims that upon returning, he was assigned to a windowless, poorly ventilated former telephone room.
A telephone room? lacking janitorial service and lacking any natural light.
And it was right next to a noisy break area with slamming doors.
What's fascinating here is why he includes those specific sensory details.
Oh, absolutely, because in federal employment law, you can't just sue because your boss is annoying or, your desk is kind of subpar.
Right, you had to prove an adverse employment action or a materially hostile work environment.
Exactly. So by detailing the lack of ventilation or how the slamming doors exacerbated his tinnitus and migraines.
The natural light issue, too.
Right. He is legally arguing that these aren't just petty slights. He's saying they are punitive, medically contraindicated conditions that were deliberately designed to force him out.
Wow. And because of that, he is demanding massive, very specific remedies.
He's definitely not just asking for his remote work back.
No. He is suing under two distinct legal frameworks.
Yeah.
The Rehabilitation Act and Title VII.
Yeah, he is pouring his claims into two separate buckets because they do different legal work.
How so?
Well, the Rehabilitation Act is basically the federal government's equivalent of the ADA. It handles the disability accommodations and the retaliation for requesting them.
Okay, got it.
And Title VII handles his claims of race discrimination. So by separating them, he actually opens up different avenues for damages.
And the damages he is asking for are just staggering.
They really are.
I mean, yes, he wants restoration of full-time telework, but he also wants retroactive promotions to the GS-13 and GS-14 levels.
Right.
Plus, he's asking for $750,000 for loss of future earning capacity.
And another $900,000 in compensatory damages.
Yeah, and he specifically allocates that $900,000 as $300,000 per violation for 3 distinct acts.
Which, by the way, is a highly sophisticated move for a pro-C plaintiff.
Why is that?
Well, federal employment law often places statutory caps on compensatory damages based on the size of the employer. For massive agencies, it usually maxes out at $300,000.
I see.
Yeah. So by legally separating his experience into 3 distinct, temporally separate violations and attaching the maximum $300,000 to each, he is attempting to bypass a single statutory cap.
That is clever. He's also demanding 3 months of administrative leave annually, which is just wild.
He's building a blueprint designed to force maximum institutional correction.
Okay, so we have the plaintiff's blueprint. It is detailed, it's visceral, and it is expensive.
Very expensive.
But, as you know, litigation's a two-way street.
Always.
The government doesn't just look at this blueprint and start arguing about the acoustics of the slamming break room doors. They build a wall.
A massive legal wall.
Right. And we see that clearly in the defendant's answer, which was filed on January 28, 2026.
Yeah, filed by a team of DOJ attorneys, including Todd Blanche representing Secretary Noam.
So an answer is basically the government's formal response to the complaint, right?
Exactly. It's a purely tactical document. The government's strategy here is basically containment.
Containment.
Yeah, they admit only the most basic, undeniable demographic and timeline facts. They admit he is an African-American male, that he's been employed since 2014, that Noam is the secretary.
That he teleworked full-time from March 2020 through April 2022.
Right, and that he engaged in protected activity. But literally almost every single other specific allegation in that massive blueprint is met with a standard legal denial.
Okay, wait, so the government's lawyers just say denied almost everything. They don't even try to explain why the room had no windows? Is that just playing hardball, or is that standard legal operating procedure?
It is absolutely standard operating procedure. Because of how federal pleading standards work, an answer is about strategy, not storytelling.
I read this answer. They issue a blanket denial to the physical state of the room. How is that not perjury? If the room actually lacks a window, you can't just deny architecture. The DOJ can't just lie about a physical space, can they?
It isn't perjury, and here's why. In a legal answer, a denial doesn't necessarily mean we are stating as a matter of absolute fact that this room had a beautiful bay window.
Right.
Legally, a denial simply means we refuse to concede this point and we demand that you prove it with admissible evidence.
Oh, wow. So if they admit the room was windowless in the answer, Whitfield never has to prove it at trial.
Exactly. The government is just forcing him to do the evidentiary work.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But then they go a step further. They don't just deny things, they lay down 19 affirmative defenses.
Yes, 19 specific legal shields.
For anyone who hasn't stared down a federal docket before, an affirmative defense is essentially a legal tripwire.
That's a great analogy.
It's the defense saying, even if every single word the plaintiff says about that windowless room is true, the court still has to throw the case out because of this underlying rule.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these 19 defenses show the massive arsenal the federal government brings to an employment dispute.
What kind of tripwires are we talking about?
Well, they claim Whitfield failed to fully exhaust his administrative remedies.
Which means what, practically?
It means if he checked the wrong box on an EEO form 3 years ago, or maybe filed a piece of paper a day late, the court loses jurisdiction to even hear the case.
Wow. Just over technicality.
Yep. They also claim he failed to mitigate his damages. And they invoke all these equitable doctrines with fancy names like latches, waivers, and unclean hands.
Yeah, unclean hands essentially means you can't ask a judge for a favor if you've been acting unethically in the background of the dispute yourself.
Exactly. But defense number 6 is the one that really anchors their wall.
Right, I noticed that one. It explicitly states that the defendant engaged in the interactive process, and any accommodation not provided was due to undue hardship.
And that is the ultimate defense under the Rehabilitation Act. The government is arguing that granting full-time remote work for an import specialist creates an undue hardship on the agency's operations.
But the legal tension there is so obvious. How does the government prove that full-time telework is an operational hardship when they admitted in the very same document that he successfully did it from March 2020 through April 2022?
Right. That is the exact friction point that would eventually have to go to a jury.
But the government doesn't want this to go to a jury.
Of course not. They want to kill the case in its crib.
Which brings us to the real legal bottleneck of this deep dive, the motion to dismiss.
Yes. Before a case ever reaches the dramatic, courtroom trial phase you see on TV, the defense will use every tool available to get it thrown out entirely.
And that brings us to Judge Hernan de Vera's January 9, 2026 order deciding exactly that issue.
So the government filed a motion to dismiss Whitfield's racial discrimination claim under Federal Rule 12b-6.
And what was their argument?
Their core argument was that Whitfield's complaint was completely devoid of any quote-unquote evidence to establish a prima facie case of discrimination under Title VII.
So they're saying he didn't prove his claims in his initial filing.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Judge Vera has to step in and decide what the actual standard is just to get in the door.
Exactly.
I like to think of it like trying to get past a bouncer at an exclusive club. You walk up to the velvet rope, right? You don't need to prove to the bouncer that you are the star of the show inside. You don't need to perform a dance routine or provide a DNA swab to prove you belong.
That would be ridiculous.
Exactly. You just need to show an ID that matches the guest list. You just have to show enough credentials to prove it is plausible you should be let in.
I love that analogy. And in the legal world, checking that ID is what the courts call the plausibility standard.
And Judge Vera breaks this down brilliantly.
He really does. He cites the landmark Supreme Court case, Ashcroft v. Iqbal. And Iqbal dictates that a complaint only needs to contain sufficient factual matter to state a claim that is plausible on its face.
So the plaintiff doesn't need bulletproof evidence at stage one. The story just has to make logical legal sense.
Exactly. But Judge Vera actually takes the DOJ to task on this a bit. He explicitly states that pleading a case and proving a case are two entirely different universes.
Yeah, he cites another Supreme Court case, Swierkiewicz v. Surema N.A., reminding the government that a prima facie case, the actual evidence of discrimination, is an evidentiary standard for a trial.
Right. It is not a pleading requirement for a complaint.
The government was essentially demanding that Whitfield produce his trial evidence before the trial even started.
Which is impossible. But Judge Vera looks at the specific blueprint Whitfield drafted. Remember, Whitfield alleged a pattern.
Right. He claimed CBP was actively excluding African-American males from telework and favorable assignments, while simultaneously granting those exact same telework accommodations to similarly situated non-Black employees.
And Judge Vera writes that applying, quote, judicial experience and common sense, these allegations are plausible.
So the bouncer unclips the velvet rope.
Exactly. The motion to dismiss is denied.
Which is a massive procedural victory for a pro-se plaintiff.
Oh, huge. Because of what it unlocks, which is discovery.
Right, the discovery phase.
The government was complaining that Whitfield had no evidence. Well, of course he didn't. The internal emails, the HR data, the comparative employee schedules, all of that was locked inside the federal agency he was suing.
So by surviving the motion to dismiss, Whitfield gains the subpoena power to legally demand those documents.
Exactly.
But, the procedural chess match never really stops. There is this tiny caveat, a footnote at the bottom of Judge Vera's order, that completely recontextualizes the timeline of our documents today.
Yeah, this part is fascinating. The judge notes in that footnote that Whitfield actually dropped a Title VII claim regarding a failure to promote him in a second amended complaint.
And the judge says, If he wants that claim back, he must file a third amended complaint by February 6, 2026.
Which perfectly explains the timeline of the government's wall.
Yes, Whitfield clearly filed that third amended complaint to get his promotion claim back on the board.
Right. Which is exactly why the DOJ's answer from Segment 2, filed on January 28, was specifically responding to a third amended complaint.
It's like a constant dance. Every time the plaintiff adjusts the blueprint, the government instantly adjusts the wall, throwing down those 19 defenses to lock the new claims in place.
It really highlights how dynamic and aggressive this early stage of litigation is.
So just look at the ground we've covered today for you guys listening. We started in a windowless, noisy former telephone room, looking at the meticulous blueprint of a disabled veteran fighting to keep a schedule he held for years.
And then we slammed into a massive wall of 19 government defenses built on strategic denial and procedural tripwires.
Right. And finally, we walked straight into a federal judge's chambers to see the bouncer at the velvet rope, separating what must be proven today from what can be discovered tomorrow.
Yeah. And if you take away anything from these documents, it should be an understanding of just how high the stakes are right now in employment law.
Absolutely. Because as the modern workplace rapidly evolves, the battle lines over what actually constitutes a reasonable accommodation versus what is an undue hardship for an employer are actively being rewritten in courts right now.
Yeah, this litigation machinery we just walked through is actively defining the future of where and how we are allowed to work.
It is arguably the defining workplace tension of the decade, which leaves you, the listener, with something pretty heavy to mull over on your own. Think about this. If a highly rated, 100% disabled veteran who successfully worked remotely for years has to engage in a massive federal lawsuit, navigating 19 affirmative defenses and complex Supreme Court pleading standards, just to maintain that exact same working arrangement, what does this mean for the future of the American workplace?
It's a great question.
Will our physical office spaces increasingly become ground zero for an entirely new wave of civil rights and accessibility battles?
It certainly looks that way.
Think about that the next time you hear a debate about returning to the office. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Hey, it's Mark, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Employee Survival Guide. If you'd like to be interviewed for our podcast and share your story about what you're going through at work, and do so anonymously, please send me an email at mcarey@capclaw.com. And also, if you like this podcast episode and others like it, please leave us a review. It really does help others find this podcast. So leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to this podcast. Thank you very much, and glad to be of service to you.